Today I'm with Professor Richard Wilding of Cranfield's Centre for Logistics and Supply Chain. And I was asking Richard about supply chain representation on the board. Richard, is there a problem with supply chain representation on the board?
Recently I was at the European Supply Chain Summit in Dusseldorf, and this is an event attended by many supply chain directors, supply chain professionals from companies from all over Europe. And we were using a technology called Spot Me, which enables people to actually sit in the conference and vote on particular issues. And I was actually chairing the conference, so I asked the question, how many companies here have supply chain representation on the boardroom? I was very surprised to find out that 52% of organisations present at that event, they had no supply chain representation in the boardroom. So we're talking about half of the companies not having any representation in the boardroom. A key thing, though, of why we need to have representation in the boardroom is really to ensure the integration between both supply chain and marketing. In other words, the market generation part of the business and then the supply part of the business as well. And it was very interesting because I asked another question about associated with this area, which was how integrated are the marketing functions and the supply chain functions within the organisations. So once again we asked the conference that one, and 66% said there was no or very low levels of integration. Now the problem is that if you don't have that level of integration, it creates all sorts of issues for the business. At the end of the day, a business has a corporate strategy. That then links into competitive strategy. The competitive strategy is really thinking about, well, how are we going to serve the various customer groups that we have? And if we don't have strong links between the operational supply chain function and also the marketing function, that is going to have a significant impact on the organisation and its growth.
In which case, why should the boardroom be concerned about supply chain?
The board needs to be concerned about the supply chain because the impact of poor supply chain practice can have on shareholder value. I think this is the best thing to relate it to, shareholder value. There was some recent research which is actually done by Single and Hendricks from Georgia State University, and what they did was they looked at what they called supply chain glitches. Now, supply chain glitch was a problem in somebody's supply chain, and what impact did that have on the share price of an organisation over time? And what they found was that organisations that had a supply chain glitch, you found that 20% of the value of that business could be written off over a couple of months. Right? There's a significant drop in the value of the business. So this is something which is really we need to be aware of. And back at the European Supply Chain Summit, I asked the question of all the companies there once again. How many people here have experienced a problem in their supply chain, a major disruption in their supply chain over the last 12 months? Believe it or not, 52% of businesses said that they had experienced a major problem within the last 12 months. I then carried on to ask those people who had actually said we'd had a problem, how many of those had noticed an impact on their share price because of that event? And it was about 30% of those businesses had seen their share price drop because of an event in their supply chain. So I think that the argument that you can put forward to the boardroom really is that you need to be very aware of this because it can have a big impact on the value of your organisation, basically the shareholder value of your business.
That's interesting. So how do you work with the board to motivate them to understand the impact of supply chain on their business?
When I'm working with the board, what I generally find is a good way to get them create an awareness of the impact the supply chain has is by linking everything back to shareholder value. So for example, what you can show is that if you think about the concept of shareholder value, there are a number of key drivers which are associated with that. What we have working capital efficiency, for example, and the supply chain can influence that. We have fixed capital efficiency, of course, We need to generate profitable growth, and that's all about serving customers and so on and so forth. We also need to minimise costs, and the supply chain, a lot of an organisation's cost base can be embedded in the supply chain, so we need to address that. But also tax minimisation is a big issue. So a concept which is being talked about now is tax efficient supply chain management, and what you're able to do is to really set up the businesses, locate your assets, and so on and so forth, to get the most tax efficient way of really delivering goods and serving a particular customer. So that's all very useful. And then what we're able to do then is for each line in the income statement and also the balance sheet is show how the supply chain, key supply chain variables impact on those particular issues. So you can look at all the various lines, about profitability and so on and so forth, inventories, and then you can show how the supply chain influences that. And I think what's interesting about this, some of the work which is being done now, it talks about the power of 1%. If you can get a 1% change in some of those key variables in your profit and loss account, balance sheet and so on and so forth, you can create significant changes within the performance of the business. So that's often a really good way to be able to wake the board up to this being a big issue for their organisation. Really picking up on the two issues. We can use the carrot and stick approach really. If you don't do something about it, watch out, you may lose 20% of your shareholder value, but if you do something about it, you can actually create more shareholder value because you can use the supply chain to leverage more growth within your business.
Richard, thanks a lot.